Hey guys, welcome to today's episode. In this episode, we're going to drift back through time and explore what life was really like for peasants in medieval Europe. It wasn't glamorous, and in truth, it was often harsh and unforgiving. But it's a story worth telling because it gives us a window into how most people actually lived hundreds of years ago. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's slowly step into the world of the Middle Ages together. To understand why it truly sucked to be a peasant in medieval Europe, we need to begin right at the start of life. With the moment of birth, because this was the very first moment where fortune or misfortune was decided, and for the vast majority of people it was misfortune. Being born a peasant was not a temporary stage of life, not a condition that could be changed with hard work, luck, or determination. It was a lifelong identity, a binding social status that was determined before you ever opened your eyes. Unlike in later centuries, where the rise of trade or new opportunities might have offered a chance at advancement, medieval Europe was rigid and deeply hierarchical. The nobility, the clergy, and the peasants were not just classes, but separate worlds, and they were worlds with very little overlap. A child born to a noble family might expect wealth, power, and education, while a child born to peasants could expect a lifetime of toil, hardship, and obedience. This rigid structure was reinforced not only by custom and law, but also by religion, as the church taught that God had placed each person in their station, and that to question it was not only rebellious but sinful. So, from the very beginning, a peasant's life was shaped by inevitability. Birth itself was fraught with danger. Most peasants were born at home, in small one-room cottages, where conditions were anything but sanitary. There were no midwives trained in medicine as we would think of them today, though there were often women in the village who had experience helping with births. Still, complications were common, and many mothers did not survive childbirth. Likewise, infants faced enormous risks from infection, premature birth, or simply the fragility of life without medical care. Historians estimate that infant mortality rates could have been as high as 30 to 50% in some areas, meaning that almost half of all children born never reached adulthood. For peasant families, this reality was heartbreaking, yet it was also expected. Death in infancy was woven into the fabric of life, and while grief was real and profound, parents often knew that not every child would survive. Those who did survive entered a world of hardship from the start. Childhood in the medieval sense bore little resemblance to what we think of today. There was no notion of a protected period of play and learning. No idea that children should be sheltered from adult responsibilities until they were ready. Instead, from the time a child was old enough to walk and understand simple instructions, they were expected to contribute to the household. Even very young children were given tasks suited to their age. Gathering sticks for firewood, helping to carry water, keeping watch over geese or chickens. By the age of 7 or 8, most children were already working alongside their parents in the fields, planting, weeding, or harvesting crops. Education, for nearly all peasant children, was non-existent. Literacy was rare outside of the clergy and the nobility, and a peasant child would almost never be taught to read or write. Instead, their lessons came through observation, imitation, and necessity. They learned how to plant by watching their parents plant, how to herd by following older siblings, and how to survive by slowly absorbing the endless rhythms of peasant life. This lack of opportunity was compounded by the unbreakable nature of social class. A peasant child might dream of a better life, but the structure of society left no room for mobility. They were tied to the land, often literally in the case of serfs, who were legally bound to the estate where they were born. Even free peasants, who had slightly more autonomy, were still shackled by poverty, lack of resources, and the demands of their lords. The feudal system, which dominated Europe, was built on the idea that peasants existed to serve. They worked the land, producing the food that sustained not only themselves, but also their lords and the church. In return, they were granted the right to live on that land, but it was never truly theirs. From birth, the expectation was clear. You worked, you obeyed, and you endured. Religion played a crucial role in shaping how children understood their place in the world. The church taught that God had arranged society into 3 orders: those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. Peasants were the workers, and their toil was not only necessary, but divinely ordained. Priests often reminded their congregations that obedience and humility were virtues, and that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. For peasant children, these messages were absorbed from their earliest days. They learned not only to work, but also to accept the inevitability of their role. Questioning the structure of society was rare, and when it did occur, it was often met with harsh punishment. This cycle of acceptance was passed down from generation to generation, keeping peasants locked in their station with little chance of change. Despite these grim realities, peasant families still found moments of joy and love. Parents cared for their children, and bonds within families were strong. The loss of a child was devastating, even if it was common. When children did survive, they were valued, not just as future workers, but as beloved members of the household. Play still existed, though it was often simple and improvised. Children might create games from sticks, stones, or bits of cloth, or they might simply run and chase one another in the fields. These moments of laughter were fleeting, but they were real, and they offered small pockets of happiness in lives otherwise dominated by struggle. Still, even these moments were overshadowed by the looming responsibilities of adulthood, which came far sooner than it does today. By the early teenage years, many peasant children were already considered adults in practice, expected to work long hours, marry young, and begin raising families of their own. The environment in which these children grew up also reinforced the harshness of their existence. Peasant cottages were small, dark, and smoky, with little comfort. Families often lived in a single room, where cooking, eating, and sleeping all took place. Beds were shared, straw pallets laid out on the floor, and warmth was hard to come by in the winter. Disease spread easily in these cramped conditions, and with limited medical knowledge, even minor illnesses could become deadly. Children were especially vulnerable to sickness, and outbreaks of plague, dysentery, or even measles could wipe out large portions of a village's youth. Survival was not guaranteed, and every year brought new challenges that threatened to take lives away. For those who endured, the lessons of childhood were clear. Life was hard, and it demanded resilience. A child learned quickly that work was endless, that food was never guaranteed, and that obedience to both family and lord was essential. These lessons, learned early and reinforced constantly, shaped peasants into adults who rarely questioned their lot. It was not that they lacked imagination, but rather that the structure of their society offered no room for dreams to become reality. What hope could a child have for change when every generation before them had lived and died in the same way? And so, Chapter 1 of the peasant's story is one of inevitability. From the moment of birth, a child's life was bound to hardship. Their survival was uncertain, their opportunities non-existent, and their future predetermined. Childhood, rather than being a time of innocence, was a period of preparation for a lifetime of toil. It was a stage in life where the harshness of the world revealed itself early, and often where the bonds of family provided comfort but could not shield them from the reality of poverty, disease, and labor. A peasant child in medieval Europe was born into a cycle that seemed unbreakable, a cycle where each generation lived and worked just as the one before it had, and just as the next one would. This was the beginning of their story, and it set the tone for a life that, in almost every way, truly sucked. If childhood was a period of harsh lessons and premature responsibilities, then adulthood for the medieval peasant was a full immersion into the relentless cycle of labor that defined nearly every moment of existence. To live as a peasant in medieval Europe was, in essence, to work. Work was not a matter of choice, ambition, or personal fulfillment, but a constant necessity tied directly to survival. The seasons dictated the rhythm of life, and peasants were bound to those rhythms with little reprieve. Spring was for planting, summer for tending crops and livestock, autumn for harvesting, and winter for struggling to survive until the cycle began anew. From dawn until dusk, the peasant's world was shaped by the demands of the land, the orders of the lord, and the expectations of the community. It was backbreaking, unending work, and for most peasants, it lasted until the day they died. The land itself was both lifeline and burden. Most peasants lived in villages, surrounded by strips of farmland that were divided among families. Though none of it truly belonged to them, the land was held by a lord or noble, and peasants either worked as serfs bound to that estate or as tenants who paid rent or dues. In either case, their labor was not for themselves alone. They were required to surrender a portion of their harvest to the lord, as well as additional taxes to the church. This meant that even in years of good harvest, peasants rarely enjoyed abundance, and in years of bad harvest, they faced hunger or even starvation. The pressure to provide, not only for one's family, but also for those who owned the land, weighed heavily on every peasant, shaping a life where effort and reward rarely aligned. The physical work of farming was grueling. Fields were plowed by hand or with the help of oxen, and every stage of cultivation required intense manual labor. Men, women, and children all participated. Men often took on the heavier tasks, such as plowing or harvesting, while women tended gardens, cared for animals, spun wool, and managed household needs. But there was no clear division. Everyone worked where work was needed, and the demands of the land left little room for anyone to remain idle. Even the elderly, if they survived long enough to reach old age, were often expected to help in whatever way they could, whether through lighter tasks or childcare. Work was not seasonal in the sense of having breaks. It simply shifted in nature, depending on the time of year. Daily life began with the rising sun. There were no clocks to measure hours in the way we understand them today. Instead, peasants followed natural light and the tolling of church bells. Dawn was the start of the workday, and the first task was often tending to animals, feeding chickens, milking cows, or checking on pigs. Fields were worked through the morning and afternoon, with short breaks for meals that were typically simple, coarse, bread, pottage made of vegetables, perhaps a bit of cheese if it was available. Meat was rare, usually reserved for festivals or special occasions, and many peasants lived largely on grains and vegetables. Hunger was a constant companion, and though starvation did not occur every year, food insecurity was always in the background. The fear of poor harvests loomed large, for one bad season could mean a winter of scarcity. The obligations owed to the Lord further complicated survival. Serfs were often required to work not only their own strips of land, but also the domain, the land directly owned by the Lord. This meant that a portion of their time and labor went to cultivating crops that they would never eat, ensuring the Lord's wealth while reducing their own ability to provide for their families. These obligations were not negotiable. Refusing them could bring severe punishment, ranging from fines to physical discipline, or in extreme cases, imprisonment. For peasants, this meant that their labor was doubly exhausting. They worked for their own survival and for the enrichment of those who ruled over them. The imbalance was stark and unrelenting. Despite the hardships, the village community provided a framework for survival. Work was often communal, especially during planting and harvest, when many hands were needed to complete the tasks in time. Families helped one another, and neighbors relied on mutual support to endure the constant demands of rural life. Yet, this cooperation was not free of tension. Resources were scarce, and disputes over land, animals, or obligations were common. The manorial court, presided over by the lord or his steward, resolved these disputes, but justice was rarely impartial. Peasants often had little choice but to accept decisions that favored the powerful, further cementing their subordinate position. Life was also dominated by the ever-present demands of the church. The peasants' work was not only economic, but also spiritual. Every week, a portion of their labor or produce went to the church in the form of tithes, typically 1/10 of their harvest. Beyond this, religious festivals punctuated the calendar, offering rare days of rest, but also reinforcing the church's authority. Priests reminded peasants that their suffering was part of God's plan, and that obedience and toil would be rewarded in heaven. This message was both a comfort and a constraint. It gave meaning to the endless labor, but it also discouraged rebellion, ensuring that peasants accepted their role rather than challenging it. For women, work extended beyond the fields into the household, where survival depended on their constant effort. They managed cooking, brewing ale, weaving cloth, and raising children, all while assisting in agricultural tasks. Their labor was undervalued, often taken for granted, yet it was essential. The survival of the family hinged on the work of peasant women as much as it did on the men, and in many cases, women carried a double burden of responsibilities. The heavy physical toll of childbirth, combined with the expectation of continual labor, meant that women's lives were often shorter and harsher than those of men. The toll of this unending work was profound. Bodies aged quickly under the strain, and few peasants lived past their 40s or 50s. Injuries, untreated illnesses, and malnutrition all contributed to a life expectancy that was shockingly low by modern standards. Yet peasants endured, generation after generation, because they had no alternative. Work was not merely an economic necessity, it was the very condition of existence. To stop working was to risk death, not only for oneself, but for one's family. And yet, within this bleak reality, peasants found ways to endure. Songs, stories, and traditions were passed down during moments of rest, offering brief escapes from the monotony of labor. Festivals, though few and far between, provided chances for celebration and communal joy. These moments were fleeting, but they were essential. They reminded peasants that life, even in its harshest form, could still hold meaning, love, and connection. Without them, the endless cycle of toil would have been unbearable. Still, the defining truth of peasant adulthood remained. Work consumed everything. It shaped their days, their bodies, their relationships, and their futures. There was no escape, no retirement, no respite. Labor was not simply a part of life, it was life itself. This is perhaps the clearest reason why it sucked to be a peasant in medieval Europe. Their existence was bound not by choice, but by obligation, not by dreams but by necessity, and from sunrise to sunset, year after year, they bore the crushing weight of work that seemed never to end. If endless work defined the daily existence of medieval peasants, then hunger and poverty were the shadows that followed them through life. Food was always uncertain, and the thin line between subsistence and starvation was one of the most precarious realities of peasant life. To be born into a peasant family was to inherit not only the land one worked, but also the constant anxiety of whether the harvest would be enough to see the family through the year. Even in times of relative abundance, meals were meager, repetitive, and rarely satisfying. In years when harvests failed, life slipped quickly into desperation, with hunger gnawing at the body and despair weighing heavily on the mind. The peasant diet was shaped by necessity rather than preference. Bread formed the staple, baked from coarse grains such as rye, barley, or oats. White bread, made from finely milled wheat, was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, while peasants consumed dense, dark loaves that were sometimes stretched with peas, beans, or even ground acorns when grain supplies were low. Alongside bread, peasants ate pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and whatever scraps might be available. Pottage could be boiled endlessly, with ingredients added as they came to hand, making it a practical dish that reflected the constant improvisation of survival. For many, this was the daily meal, eaten morning and evening, with little variation. Meat was a rarity, seldom appearing on the table of the ordinary peasant. Most families could not afford to slaughter their livestock, as animals represented valuable resources. Cows provided milk, sheep gave wool, and chickens laid eggs. To kill them for meat was often a last resort or an indulgence reserved for holidays and festivals. Instead, peasants relied on whatever protein they could find from less glamorous sources: beans, peas, cheese, or fish, particularly herring, which was salted and preserved for long storage. Hunting was typically forbidden by law, reserved as the exclusive right of nobles, and the penalties for poaching could be severe, ranging from heavy fines to mutilation or death. Yet many peasants risked it out of desperation, snaring rabbits or birds in the forest, gathering nuts, berries, and mushrooms when fields failed to provide enough. The cycle of hunger was closely tied to the agricultural calendar. After the autumn harvest, food stores were at their fullest, and meals in the winter months, though still humble, were relatively secure. But as the year wore on, and spring approached, supplies dwindled. This period, sometimes referred to as the hungry gap, was the most dangerous time of year. Grain stores ran low, last year's vegetables spoiled, and new crops had not yet matured. Families stretched meals with thin gruels or watered-down pottage, often going to bed hungry. Malnutrition was a silent killer, weakening bodies and leaving them vulnerable to disease. Children especially suffered, their growth stunted, their resilience sapped by a lack of nourishment. Famine, when it came, was devastating. Crop failures could be caused by poor weather, blight, or pests, and in a world without modern farming techniques or reliable reserves, entire regions could be plunged into hunger. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 stands as one of the starkest examples. When relentless rain ruined harvests across northern Europe, grain rotted in the fields, livestock perished, and food prices soared beyond the reach of common people. For peasants, it meant a collapse into starvation, and in some places, desperate measures were whispered about families scavenging for anything edible, stripping bark from trees, or worse. Death from hunger was not quick or merciful. It was a slow wasting away, marked by weakness, disease, and despair. Even in ordinary years, poverty weighed heavily on peasants. They lived without surplus, without savings, without any margin of security. Taxes, rents, and tithes consumed much of what little they produced, leaving families with barely enough to survive. Clothing was patched and repatched until it could no longer hold together, and shoes were often a luxury beyond reach. Homes were small, cold, and smoky, their thatched roofs and earthen floors offering little protection against the elements. When illness struck, there was no money for remedies or healers, and many simply endured or succumbed. Poverty was not just the absence of wealth, it was the constant presence of vulnerability, where one bad season, one accident, one illness could unravel an entire family's survival. The psychological burden of hunger and poverty cannot be overlooked. The anxiety of not knowing if the harvest would be enough, of watching children cry from hunger, of owing debts to the Lord or church that could not be paid. These were the invisible torments of peasant life. It fostered a sense of fatalism, reinforced by the church's teachings. That suffering was part of God's plan. Hunger was not seen merely as misfortune, but as a test of endurance, a trial to be borne with humility. This religious framing provided some comfort, but also discouraged resistance, making it easier for the system of exploitation to continue unchecked. Yet peasants were resourceful. They made do with what they had, finding ways to survive even in scarcity. Wild foods supplemented diets, with foraging providing berries, nuts, herbs, and mushrooms. Fishing in rivers and streams, though sometimes restricted by law, added protein when available. Women played a vital role in stretching meals, using herbs and knowledge passed down through generations to flavor bland food and preserve what little they had. Communal ovens in villages allowed for bread to be baked more efficiently, and neighbors often shared resources in times of hardship, bound together by the shared struggle to endure. Still, poverty meant that leisure or indulgence was almost unknown. The wealthy could feast, wear fine clothes, and enjoy luxuries imported from abroad, while peasants lived on the edge of want. This stark contrast was not lost on them, and though open resentment was dangerous, it simmered beneath the surface of medieval society. Stories and songs often poked fun at greedy lords or corrupt priests, small acts of defiance that voiced the frustrations of those who had little power. Hunger and poverty were endured, but they also bred bitterness, a sense of injustice that occasionally erupted into rebellion, as seen in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. For children, the cycle of hunger was particularly cruel. Malnourished from birth, many did not survive infancy. Those who did often bore the lifelong effects of poor nutrition, weak bodies, susceptibility to illness, and shortened lives. The struggle to feed children weighed heavily on mothers, whose own health suffered from pregnancy after pregnancy, compounded by the need to continue working despite exhaustion and poor diet. The fragility of life was evident in every village, where small graves and churchyards marked the cruel reality of childhood mortality. In the end, hunger and poverty were constants in the life of a peasant, shaping not just what they ate, but how they lived, thought, and hoped. The daily search for food, the scraping together of resources, the enduring of cold winters and lean springs, all were threads in the fabric of their existence. It is difficult, from the comfort of the modern world, to truly grasp what it meant to live under such conditions, to face hunger not as an occasional discomfort, but as a defining feature of life. And yet, for the vast majority of medieval Europeans, this was reality. Hunger gnawed at them, not only in their stomachs, but in their very understanding of what life could be, a constant reminder of how fragile survival truly was. This, too, is why it sucked to be a peasant in medieval Europe. Work was crushing, yes, but work without food, without security, without hope of improvement, made life a harsh and grinding struggle. To live was to endure hunger, to carry poverty like a shadow, and to hope, with each passing season, that survival might once again be bought with sweat and sacrifice. If hunger was the constant shadow over the peasant's table, then disease was the invisible predator that lurked around every corner, striking without warning and with devastating consequences. To be a peasant in medieval Europe was to live with the daily reality of sickness and death, not as rare misfortunes, but as expected parts of life. Illness was everywhere. In the fields, in the village, in the very air and water. And with medicine still bound to superstition, tradition, and limited knowledge, there was little hope of real treatment. For peasants, disease was not only terrifying in its suddenness, but also crushing in its inevitability. It was not a matter of if one would become sick, but when and whether one would survive long enough to continue the endless cycle of toil. The conditions of peasant life made them especially vulnerable to disease. Their homes were small, dark, and poorly ventilated, often with dirt floors and thatched roofs that leaked in the rain. Families lived in close quarters with their animals, for livestock provided warmth in the winter and protection from thieves. But this closeness also brought fleas, lice, and other parasites into their living spaces. The constant presence of vermin spread illness, and the lack of sanitation only worsened matters. Waste often accumulated in and around the village, with no true sewage systems to carry it away. Drinking water was easily contaminated, and outbreaks of dysentery and other waterborne diseases were common. For the medieval peasant, cleanliness was not merely difficult, it was almost impossible. Childhood illnesses were particularly devastating. Many children never lived to see adulthood, succumbing to fevers, infections, or malnutrition that their fragile bodies could not withstand. Mothers gave birth at home with little to no medical assistance, and complications often proved fatal for both mother and child. Infant mortality was staggeringly high, and most families experienced the loss of at least one child. These deaths were accepted as part of life, mourned, but also endured with a resigned sorrow. To be a parent in this world was to love with the awareness that loss was always near. The great killer of the Middle Ages, of course, was plague. While the Black Death of the 14th century was its most infamous outbreak, killing vast portions of Europe's population, disease of this scale was not entirely new to peasants. Epidemics of various kinds swept through villages regularly, carried along trade routes, and thriving in the crowded conditions of medieval settlements. The Black Death was especially cruel, for it spread with such speed and intensity that entire communities were wiped out in weeks. For peasants who had already endured hunger and hardship, the sudden arrival of plague must have felt like the very hand of God, striking down neighbors and family alike with no warning and no mercy. But even beyond plague, disease was an ever-present threat. Tuberculosis, known then as the consumption, wore away at the body slowly. leaving sufferers weak and coughing up blood until death came. Leprosy, feared for its disfiguring effects, drove victims to the margins of society, often forcing them into isolation in leper colonies. Smallpox, measles, and influenza struck in waves, decimating communities. Even minor wounds could become fatal, for infection was poorly understood, and the simplest cut or blister could lead to death through sepsis. The body was fragile in this world, and the smallest misfortune could unravel a life entirely. What made sickness even more terrifying was the lack of effective medical care. The medical knowledge available to peasants was a mix of herbal remedies, local wisdom, and religious ritual. Some herbs did have healing properties, garlic for infections, willow bark for pain, but these remedies were limited, and peasants had no way of truly understanding why they worked or did not. More often, healing was left in the hands of wise women, midwives, or traveling healers who combined natural remedies with charms, prayers, and superstition. A poultice might be applied, or a chant spoken, or a relic of a saint placed upon the sick. But recovery was far from guaranteed, and more often than not, the outcome depended simply on the strength of the sufferer's body. When peasants turned to official medicine, they faced another barrier: cost. Physicians trained in universities and steeped in the medical theories of the ancient Greeks and Romans were far beyond the financial reach of most peasants. These doctors often relied on ideas of humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and sought to restore balance through methods such as bloodletting or purging. To peasants, such treatments were not only unaffordable, but often seemed as dangerous as the illness itself. For the majority, access to professional medicine was a dream that would never be realized. They were left to endure their illnesses with whatever tools their community could provide. Religion played a central role in how peasants understood disease. Illness was often seen as a punishment from God, a trial to be endured, or a sign of sin that required penance. Prayer, pilgrimages, and offerings to the church were common responses to outbreaks. Holy water might be sprinkled, relics touched, or masses said for the recovery of the sick. These practices gave comfort, but they rarely brought true healing. Yet for peasants, they reinforced the belief that suffering had meaning, that their hardships were part of a divine plan. Without this framework of faith, the random cruelty of disease might have been unbearable. For those who survived illness, the scars were lasting. Disease often left people weakened, disfigured, or disabled, and in a society where survival depended on physical labor, such outcomes could be devastating. A man who lost strength in his limbs could no longer work the fields. A woman left weakened after childbirth might struggle to care for her children. In these cases, the community sometimes stepped in to provide support, but resources were always scarce. Disability could quickly push a family into deeper poverty, leaving them reliant on charity or begging. The emotional toll of disease was profound as well. To live surrounded by sickness was to live surrounded by death. Peasants saw loved ones die frequently, often without understanding why. They carried grief as a constant companion, not in sudden moments of tragedy but in the slow, grinding rhythm of repeated loss. Families were rarely whole for long, and many households bore the memory of empty places at the table, reminders of children, parents, or siblings taken too soon. And yet, despite all of this, peasants endured. They found resilience in faith, in community, and in the small victories of survival. To live through sickness was to be tested, but also to emerge with a renewed will to continue. In a life filled with hardship, even the smallest triumph, recovering from a fever, surviving childbirth, seeing a child reach adulthood, was a cause for gratitude. The fragility of life made every moment of health precious. And perhaps this was one of the few consolations peasants could cling to in their harsh world. But the unavoidable truth remained. Disease made life unbearably precarious. It struck at random, it devastated families, and it robbed peasants of the little security they might have had. In a society already marked by hunger, poverty, and endless work, the shadow of disease ensured that life was always balanced on the edge of disaster. To be a peasant in medieval Europe was not simply to endure hardship, it was to do so while knowing that death might come at any time, in any form, and that nothing could truly prevent it. This, perhaps more than anything else, is why it sucked to be a peasant. Their lives were not only short and laborious, but also constantly haunted by the specter of sickness that no prayer, no herb, and no effort could truly keep at bay. Before we continue, I just want to pause for a moment to say thank you for staying with me this far. If you're enjoying this journey through the struggles of medieval peasants, it would mean a lot if you could give this video a like. It really helps others discover the channel, and it lets me know you'd like to see more stories like this. And if you haven't already, make sure you resubscribed so you won't miss the next chapter in our travels through history. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Do you think you could have managed the endless labor and hardships of peasant life, or would it have been too much? Share your answer in the comments below. Now, let's step back into the Middle Ages and continue the story. Life for peasants in medieval Europe was not only defined by hunger, disease, and the daily grind of survival, but also by the crushing weight of taxes and obligations, owed to both the lords who ruled over the land and the church that claimed to govern their souls. From the moment a peasant could work the land, their labor was not truly their own, and the fruits of that labor were divided long before they could even think about feeding their families. At the heart of this system was the manorial economy, a structure in which peasants, often known as serfs, worked the lands of their lords in exchange for protection and the right to live on small strips of farmland. While in theory this might sound like a fair trade, in practice it created an endless cycle of toil and payment in which peasants gave up much of what they produced and still lived on the edge of starvation. A peasant family might till their fields for weeks, growing crops like barley, rye, or oats, and then discover at harvest time that a large portion of that yield was immediately taken as rent or dues. This was not a matter of choice but of obligation, written into the very fabric of medieval life. Beyond the demands of the Lord, there was also the church. Religion permeated every part of medieval society, and while it offered hope of salvation, it also demanded material sacrifice. The tithe, a tax of roughly 1/10 of a peasant's income or produce, was owed to the local parish church. If a family harvested 10 sacks of grain, one of those sacks would go straight to the church, leaving them with even less to live on. And this tithe was unavoidable. Refusing to pay could mean excommunication, public shame, or even punishment. On top of that, peasants were expected to contribute to the upkeep of the church building itself, supply food for traveling clergy, and give special offerings during feast days or religious festivals. In other words, the very institution that promised comfort in the next life often added to the hardships of this one. The combination of lordly dues and church tithes meant that peasants lived with constant pressure. Even in a good year, when the harvest was plentiful, much of what they grew or raised left their hands almost immediately. In a bad year, when weather or disease ravaged the fields, peasants still owed the same obligations. This often forced them to borrow food or grain from wealthier neighbors or from the manor's stores, only to fall further into debt. It was not uncommon for families to end a year with nothing left, forced to survive the winter on scraps, thin pottage made of whatever roots they could dig up, or even bark and acorns when times grew truly desperate. The psychological burden of knowing that your family's survival depended not just on your own labor but on the unpredictable demands of others weighed heavily on the peasant mind. Labor services added another layer of obligation. Many peasants were bound to work their lord's domain, the portion of land kept directly for the lord's use, several days a week, without pay. This meant that while they struggled to cultivate their own strips of farmland, they also had to spend long hours plowing, sowing, and harvesting for their master. In some regions, peasants were also expected to provide additional labor in times of need, such as during harvest or when repairs were needed on the manor house, mills, or roads. These demands could be called upon at any time, often disrupting the careful balance of a peasant household's own survival. To refuse was unthinkable. Obedience was enforced not only by tradition but by law and the ever-present threat of punishment. The weight of obligations extended even to death. When a peasant passed away, their family could not simply inherit their possessions. Instead, they often had to pay a heriot, a form of death tax, which might include the best animal from their herd or other valuable possessions, handed over to the lord before inheritance was granted. This meant that even in death, peasants could not escape the reach of those who controlled their lives. Marriage, too, could carry a price, as peasants were sometimes required to seek permission from their lord and even pay a fee to marry outside the manor. In this way, every stage of life, birth, marriage, work, and death, was entangled with dues and payments that chipped away at the little freedom peasants might have had. What made these obligations even more difficult was that they were accepted as natural by nearly everyone in society. The medieval worldview was structured around the belief that society was divided into 3 estates: those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. The peasants were firmly placed in the last category, and it was widely believed that their suffering was both necessary and divinely ordained. Lords claimed their wealth was justified by their duty to protect the land and its people, while the church insisted that offerings and tithes were essential for the salvation of souls. For peasants, there was little room to question these ideas. Generations were raised to see them as inevitable, part of the order of things. Of course, not every peasant accepted this fate without resistance. Records survive of complaints, petitions, and even revolts. One of the most famous was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands rose up against unfair taxation and oppressive systems, demanding greater freedoms and relief from crushing burdens. Although most revolts were suppressed with brutal force, they revealed the simmering discontent beneath the surface of medieval life. These moments of defiance, however rare, show that peasants were not entirely powerless. Yet they also demonstrate just how deeply unfair the system was. Because only extraordinary circumstances could push people to risk everything for change. And yet, despite all these struggles, peasants carried on. They found ways to adapt, to make do with little, and to carve out moments of humanity amidst the weight of taxes and obligations. The fact that families endured generation after generation, managing to keep their traditions, their communities, and their hope alive, is a testament to their resilience. But make no mistake, the system of dues, taxes, and obligations was designed to keep them poor, to keep them dependent, and to ensure that their labor always served others first. For the medieval peasant, freedom was not measured in wealth or opportunity, but in the rare moments when their lords and the church left them enough to simply survive. From the moment the first light of dawn crept across the fields, the medieval peasant's day began, not with leisure or reflection, but with the unending demands of labor that left little energy for anything else. There was no question of whether to work. Work was life itself, as necessary as breathing, and the survival of an entire family depended on the willingness and ability to toil from sunrise to sunset. Men, women, and even children took part, each carrying their share of the burden. And the rhythm of their lives was dictated by the cycle of the seasons and the needs of the land. In springtime, fields had to be plowed and sown with grain, a task that could consume days of backbreaking effort. The plow itself, often heavy and rudimentary, was dragged by oxen or sometimes by men when animals were not available, while peasants trudged behind, guiding the blade through thick soil, often stony and uneven. Hands grew blistered, shoulders ached, and backs bent under the strain. Yet there was no respite because a late planting could mean a poor harvest, and a poor harvest could mean hunger, debt, or worse. The work did not ease with the changing seasons. Summer brought long, exhausting days of tending crops, weeding, and watching over animals. Fields of rye, barley, oats, and wheat had to be carefully maintained, while vegetables grown in small garden plots required daily attention. Livestock, chickens, pigs, goats, and cattle, needed feeding, watering, and guarding, for they were as vital to survival as the fields themselves. If an animal was lost to disease, or stolen by wolves or thieves, the impact could be catastrophic. For peasant women, the load was doubled. They worked the fields alongside their husbands and brothers, but they were also responsible for household labor. From grinding grain into flour to baking bread, brewing ale, spinning wool, weaving cloth, tending to children and preparing meals with whatever meager resources were available. It was a constant cycle of tasks, each one essential, leaving no time for idleness and little room for error. When autumn arrived, the workload intensified even further. Harvest was the most critical time of year, and entire villages came together to gather crops. Before the weather turned cold, and the fields were lost to frost, sickles and scythes flashed through the air as men, women, and children cut grain, bundling sheaves and stacking them for threshing. The hours were punishing, often stretching from the first glimmer of daylight until the last possible moment before darkness made the work impossible. Failure to bring in enough grain meant the difference between having bread through the winter or going hungry. After the harvest came threshing, the process of separating the grain from the chaff, which required beating the stalks with flails in endless repetition until the kernels were free. Dust filled the air, muscles burned with exhaustion, and yet the work continued, driven by necessity rather than choice. Winter did not bring rest, as one might imagine, but only a shift in the type of labor demanded. Fields lay dormant, but peasants still had to tend animals, repair tools, mend fences, gather firewood, and spin and weave textiles for clothing. Food had to be stretched to last the cold months, which meant grinding small amounts of grain each day, and baking coarse loaves of bread that were often the only sustenance available. Winter also brought the constant battle to stay warm, as peasants trudged into forests to gather wood or dried dung for fuel, hauling heavy loads back to their cottages through freezing wind and snow. Even then, fires were small and smoky, offering only partial relief from the cold. Illnesses spread easily in the cramped, poorly ventilated homes, and though the pace of life slowed slightly, the anxiety of surviving through to spring was its own kind of labor. The sheer physicality of peasant work cannot be overstated. Fields were plowed with simple tools, wooden hoes, and spades that broke under strain. While hands were calloused and scarred from constant use, feet were often bare or poorly shod, leading to sores and infections. Injuries were common, whether from heavy lifting, accidents with tools, or the wear and tear of daily toil. And with no real medical care available, even minor wounds could linger painfully or become fatal. Children, too, were drawn into labor early, carrying water, scaring birds from crops, or helping with livestock. There was no notion of childhood as a time of carefree play. Instead, children were another set of hands to contribute to the family's survival. What made this relentless work even more cruel was that it rarely translated into prosperity. Unlike modern workers who might imagine labor leading to some form of progress, peasants labored not for advancement, but for mere survival, always under the shadow of hunger, disease, or demands from their lords. Their labor enriched others. The noble families who collected rent and taxes. The church that claimed its tithes. While leaving the peasants, themselves, with little more than the hope of making it through another year. The sense of futility must have weighed heavily, yet it was a futility softened by the fact that such conditions were all they had ever known. For generations, families had toiled under the same burdens, each season repeating the struggles of the last. So that hardship became the very fabric of life. And yet, amidst the grind, peasants found moments of rhythm and meaning. Labor was often communal, with neighbors working together in fields, singing songs to pass the time, and sharing tools and knowledge. Feasts, fairs, and festivals punctuated the calendar, offering brief but precious interruptions to the cycle of work. When music, dancing, and stories provided a glimpse of joy and togetherness, these moments, though fleeting, gave strength to continue the endless labor, reminding peasants that they were part of a larger community, bound together by shared struggle. Still, the truth remained. Work defined their lives from birth until death, and the ceaseless grind of labor, often thankless and exhausting, was the price they paid simply to exist in a world that gave them little in return. For the medieval peasant, one of the greatest burdens was not only the hunger in their stomachs, the blisters on their hands, or the ache in their backs from endless labor, but the simple, unshakable truth that their lives were not truly their own. Most peasants were bound to the land, locked into a system of feudal obligations that left them with little choice about how to live, where to go, or what to do with their time. The earth they worked did not belong to them, though they may have plowed the same fields for generations. Instead, it belonged to the lord of the manor, who claimed both their rent and their loyalty. The peasant's right to till the soil, to gather firewood, or to graze animals on the common pastures existed only because the lord allowed it, and that permission could be taken away at any time. To modern eyes, it is almost unimaginable to live with so little control over one's destiny, but for medieval peasants, this lack of freedom was simply the air they breathed, the unchanging reality of their world. Even the word serf spoke volumes, for it meant servant, in the truest sense, someone tied not just to the land, but to the authority of another human being. This bondage meant that even if a peasant dreamed of something better, of seeking fortune elsewhere, or starting fresh in a new town, that dream was almost impossible to realize. Travel was restricted, and to leave without the lord's permission could mean being hunted down, fined, or punished. The manor court, overseen by the lord's officials, reinforced these boundaries with strict rules and penalties, making sure that peasants understood their place. Marriage, too, was often controlled by the lord, who could demand payment or approval before a peasant could wed someone from outside the estate. Even the inheritance of land, that small patch of earth that a peasant might hope to pass on to his children, was not secure without the lord's consent and the payment of fees. In every corner of life, from birth to death, the presence of authority loomed, reminding peasants that they were not free individuals, but dependents whose rights were fragile and conditional. This lack of freedom was not just legal, but deeply psychological. Generations grew up knowing nothing else, and so the system perpetuated itself, each child taught to obey, to serve, and to accept their place in the hierarchy of medieval life. The church reinforced this message, preaching that God had ordained a natural order in which lords ruled, priests prayed, and peasants labored. To resist was to go against not only earthly authority, but divine will itself. This belief, drilled into minds from the pulpit and the cradle, gave the system a weight that was almost impossible to shake. For it convinced peasants that their subservience was part of a larger cosmic plan. And yet, for all the messages of obedience and acceptance, the frustration must have simmered beneath the surface. For humans have always longed for autonomy, for the chance to make choices free from the interference of others. There were, of course, occasional cracks in this rigid structure. Some peasants managed to slip away, making their way to growing towns where, after living for a year and a day without being caught, they could claim freedom as townspeople. The phrase "town air makes you free" captured this rare escape route, though it was fraught with danger and uncertainty. Others sought relief in collective action, rising in rebellion when the weight of demands became unbearable. The most famous of these was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when thousands of men and women marched to London to demand lower taxes and an end to serfdom. Though the rebellion was crushed, it revealed that peasants were not entirely passive, that under enough pressure, the desire for freedom could boil over into open defiance. Still, for the vast majority, such acts of resistance remained distant and dangerous, and the safer path was to endure, to bow to authority, and to hope that obedience would at least bring stability. This dependence on the Lord also meant that peasants lived with a constant undercurrent of fear, for their livelihoods could be disrupted not only by weather or harvest, but by the whims of those in power. A lord might raise rents, demand new services, or enforce stricter rules, and peasants had little recourse but to comply. Disputes could be brought to the manor court, but the court itself was controlled by the lord's officials, making justice a matter not of fairness, but of favor. In times of war, peasants were even more vulnerable, for their lands could be seized, their homes destroyed, and their families displaced by the conflicts of nobles who saw them as expendable resources rather than human beings. Their lack of freedom meant a lack of protection, and in every sense, they were at the mercy of forces beyond their control. And yet, peasants did carve out small spaces of autonomy where they could. Within their homes, however modest, they set the rules. They raised their children with values of resilience, passed down songs and stories that celebrated endurance, and found ways to assert their identity in small acts of defiance or independence. The community itself became a kind of shield, for neighbors could come together to support one another in times of hardship, lending tools, sharing food, or caring for one another's children. In these bonds of solidarity, peasants found a strength that helped balance the crushing weight of their lack of freedom. It was not liberty in the modern sense, but it was a kind of agency, the ability to preserve dignity in a system that denied them power. What strikes us today is how deeply human the yearning for freedom must have been. Even when constrained by the rigid walls of feudal society, to live one's life knowing that each choice was limited, that each action required permission, must have been suffocating. And yet, it was precisely within these constraints that peasants developed the patience, endurance, and subtle forms of resistance that allowed them to survive. The lack of freedom was perhaps one of the most invisible, yet most profound hardships of their existence, shaping not only what they could do, but who they believed they were allowed to be. Their story is a reminder that while bodies can be bound to land and laws, the spirit still finds ways to dream of something better, however faint or distant that dream might be. For the medieval peasant, war was not a story of knights in shining armor, or glorious battles sung by bards, but a nightmare that brought fire, blood, and ruin crashing into their lives. When nobles and kings quarreled over land, crowns, or pride, it was the peasants who paid the heaviest price. Though they had no say in the conflicts that shaped their world, armies marched across the countryside, trampling fields, seizing food, and burning homes in their wake, leaving peasants not only hungry but homeless, forced to scatter with their families in search of safety. Villages could be reduced to ash in a single night, and with no standing armies to protect them, peasants were often left defenseless against raiders, mercenaries, and soldiers, who saw them not as people but as resources to be plundered. War was not distant or noble, it was immediate and terrifying, and for the men, women, and children bound to the land, it was a devastation that could undo years of toil in an instant. One of the most destructive aspects of war was its timing. Battles rarely respected the rhythms of agricultural life. Yet the demands of armies often coincided with harvest season, when food was at its most plentiful. Soldiers would strip villages of grain, livestock, and tools, leaving peasants unable to feed themselves through the winter. Even when the fighting ended, the damage lingered, for fields left unplowed or burned would yield little in the next season, creating cycles of famine that lasted long after the war itself. Taxes and levies added to this misery, as lords demanded resources to fund their campaigns, squeezing peasants even further when they already had little left to give. In many ways, war was not just the clash of swords but the slow grinding down of ordinary people, who shouldered the burden without reward or recognition. Violence was not confined to the battlefield. Raids and pillaging were common, and peasants, lacking weapons or training, were easy targets. Women and children bore particular vulnerability. Suffering, exploitation, and abuse in times of chaos, their lives appended by acts of cruelty that often went unpunished. Homes offered little protection, and even churches, which should have been sanctuaries, were sometimes looted or desecrated. Fear became a constant companion, for the sound of hooves in the distance, or the sight of smoke rising over the hills could mean everything was about to be taken. In such moments, peasants faced impossible choices: flee and abandon what little they had, or stay and risk the wrath of soldiers who cared nothing for their lives. These were not heroic tales of courage, but desperate struggles for survival in the face of overwhelming violence. The 100 Years' War between England and France provides some of the clearest evidence of how peasants bore the brunt of conflict. Villages in contested regions were burned again and again, their inhabitants forced to rebuild, only to see destruction return. Mercenary bands roamed the countryside when not employed by kings, looting and extorting peasants for food and shelter. Similarly, during the Crusades, while lords and knights marched eastward with religious zeal, the peasants left behind often saw their own resources drained to support campaigns. they neither initiated nor benefited from. Wars of religion later in the medieval era were even more devastating, tearing communities apart from within, pitting neighbor against neighbor, and spreading violence into the very heart of daily life. In all these cases, peasants were pawns in a game far larger than themselves, their suffering invisible in the chronicles that celebrated noble victories. What made war especially cruel for peasants was its unpredictability. A family might labor for years to bring stability to their household, saving grain, repairing their home, and raising children, only to have it all erased in a single raid. Unlike famine or disease, which struck everyone to some degree, war targeted the poor most directly, for they lacked walls, castles, or armies to shield them. Even when lords promised protection in exchange for service, that protection was unreliable. For many nobles were more concerned with their own survival than that of their tenants. The social contract that bound peasants to their lords. Labor for security often broke down in times of war, leaving peasants abandoned and betrayed. Yet they had little choice but to endure, for there was nowhere else to turn. And yet, resilience once again became the hallmark of peasant life. After the flames died and the soldiers left, it was the peasants who picked up the pieces, who rebuilt cottages from charred beams, resowed fields with the handful of seed that remained, and tried to restore a sense of normalcy in the shadow of loss. Communities often came together to support one another in these moments, pooling resources and labor to ensure survival. These acts of recovery were not grand or celebrated, but they were essential. For without the peasants, the countryside would collapse, and the nobility who relied on their labor would find themselves without food or income. In this way, peasants played an invisible but vital role in sustaining medieval society even through the devastation of war. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of war for the peasant was the lack of choice. They were not soldiers by nature, though some were conscripted into militias or forced to fight for their lords. More often, they were collateral damage, their lives upended by conflicts they neither understood nor supported. They had no voice in the councils where wars were declared, no seat at the tables where peace treaties were signed. Their blood and sweat watered the soil of history, yet their names were rarely recorded. They endured the consequences of decisions made by others, decisions that seemed distant yet landed squarely on their fields and homes. This helplessness, to be caught between powers too great to resist, must have been one of the most demoralizing aspects of peasant existence during times of war. And still, even in the face of devastation, peasants continued to live, to love, and to hope. Children were born in the ashes of ruined villages, marriages were celebrated despite the loss, and faith offered comfort to those who sought meaning in suffering. These quiet acts of persistence remind us that while war may have tried to erase them, the peasants' humanity endured. It is easy to look back at medieval warfare and see only kings, knights, and battles. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was written in the lives of the peasants who survived its horrors. Their endurance was not heroic in the conventional sense, but it was the foundation upon which all of medieval society rested. War in all its cruelty revealed just how much the ordinary people bore for the ambitions of the few, and yet it also revealed their unbreakable determination to rebuild, to survive, and to carry their families forward through the darkest of times. For the medieval peasant religion was not just a belief system, but the very air they breathed, shaping every aspect of life, from birth to death. Yet it was also a force that weighed heavily on them, demanding obedience, tithes, and unquestioning faith. From the moment a peasant child was baptized, the church claimed them as one of its flock, guiding their steps with ritual and doctrine, but also controlling them through fear of sin, damnation, and the fires of hell. Life was already fragile, filled with hunger, disease, and violence. And the church offered hope of salvation beyond the grave, but it also reminded peasants constantly that their suffering was part of God's will, a trial they must endure in silence. Religion brought comfort, yes, but it also reinforced the very structures that kept peasants powerless, ensuring they accepted their lot as divinely ordained. For many, this faith was both a shield and a chain, binding them to the rhythms of the church as tightly as to the soil they tilled. The calendar of a medieval peasant was not measured only by the seasons, but by holy days, saints, feasts, and religious festivals. Nearly every month held some observance, and while these days might provide rare respite from the grueling work of the fields, they also served as reminders of the church's dominance. The ringing of church bells marked time, calling villagers to mass, or summoning them to prayer, and no aspect of life escaped the church's influence. Marriages, births, confessions, and burials all required its sanction. Priests held the power to absolve or condemn, to bless or to curse. And though they were often drawn from humble backgrounds themselves, they wielded authority that peasants dared not question. Even the smallest transgressions could be framed as sins, from missing mass to failing to pay the tithe, and fear of eternal damnation kept most peasants in line. In a world with so little certainty, the promise of heaven offered hope. but the threat of hell loomed just as strongly, casting a long shadow over daily life. Tithes were one of the most tangible burdens. Every peasant household was required to give a tenth of their produce or earnings to the church, even if they had barely enough to feed their own families. Grain, livestock, eggs, and even labor could be demanded, and the church's barns often filled while peasants went hungry. To refuse or withhold was unthinkable, for it risked not only punishment by the priest, but the terrifying prospect of spiritual condemnation. This system made the church one of the wealthiest institutions in medieval Europe, its lands rivaling those of kings and lords. Yet, this wealth was built on the backs of peasants, whose sweat and toil funded the grand cathedrals and monasteries. For the poor farmer laboring in the fields, the sight of towering stone churches rising above their thatched huts was a constant reminder of inequality sanctified in the name of God. Superstition, too, played a powerful role in shaping peasant life, filling the gaps where knowledge was scarce and fear was overwhelming. Disease, famine, storms, and bad harvests were often explained as signs of God's displeasure or the work of the devil. Evil spirits, witches and curses were seen as very real dangers, and charms, relics, or prayers were relied upon to keep them at bay. When illness struck, peasants might turn to a mixture of folk remedies, whispered incantations, and the blessings of the priest, hoping one or all might stave off death. Natural phenomena they could not understand, an eclipse, a comet, a sudden storm, were interpreted as omens, messages from the divine that foretold catastrophe or demanded penance. In this way, religion and superstition merged into a worldview where every moment of life felt precarious, governed by forces far beyond their control. The church also shaped peasants' understanding of morality and justice. To question authority, to rebel against a lord, or to resist hardship was framed not only as disobedience, but as sin. Priests often reminded their congregations that poverty and suffering were part of God's plan, and that rewards awaited only in the afterlife. This teaching, whether intentional or not, encouraged submission and acceptance, discouraging peasants from challenging the feudal order. For those who did dare to resist, excommunication, the denial of the sacraments, was a devastating punishment, cutting them off from the community and condemning their souls in the eyes of their neighbors. Fear of such spiritual exile ensured obedience as effectively as any sword or whip. Yet despite this, faith also gave peasants strength, providing rituals that brought meaning to their daily struggles and moments of shared joy during festivals that briefly lifted the burdens of toil. Pilgrimages offered another dimension to peasant faith. Though arduous and often dangerous, journeys to holy sites promised healing, forgiveness, or spiritual renewal, and even the poorest sometimes undertook them. These pilgrimages broke the monotony of village life, connecting peasants to the broader Christian world, yet they also reinforced the church's authority, reminding peasants that salvation lay not in their own hands, but in the grace mediated by the clergy and the sacred places they controlled. Miracles, relics, and saints' shrines inspired awe, but they also reinforced the sense that peasants were small figures in a vast, mysterious order, directed by powers they could never fully grasp. Despite the weight of this religious authority, peasants were not passive in their faith. They blended official doctrine with folk traditions, creating a spirituality that was both deeply Christian and deeply local. Villages often venerated their own saints or holy places, weaving together ancient customs with church practices in ways that reflected their immediate needs and fears. A field might be blessed with holy water to ensure a good harvest, or a charm might be hung in a stable to protect livestock. These small acts of devotion, though sometimes frowned upon by the higher clergy, gave peasants a sense of agency, however limited, in a world where so much was beyond their control. Faith was not simply imposed from above. It was lived, adapted, and reshaped in countless humble ways. Yet for all the comfort religion brought, it could not erase the stark inequality between the peasants and those who ruled over them in God's name. Monasteries grew rich, bishops wielded power equal to princes, and the Pope stood as the ultimate authority in Christendom, while the peasants remained in rags, their bellies empty, their hands blistered from endless work. The church taught that their reward would come only after death, but for many, that reward must have felt impossibly distant, especially when famine or plague struck. Still, peasants clung to their faith, for without it, the darkness of their lives would have been even harder to endure. Religion was both the cage that confined them and the light that guided them through it. A paradox at the heart of medieval existence that shaped the daily reality of millions. For the medieval peasant, life was a cycle that began in hardship and ended in hardship, a wheel that turned slowly and without mercy, grinding down generation after generation with little hope of escape. From the moment of birth, a child was marked by the struggles of their parents, born not into opportunity, but into obligation, bound to the land, to their lord, and to a system that had little concern for their survival, beyond the work they could provide. Childhood was brief, and innocence fleeting, as young boys and girls were expected to help in the fields. Tend animals, fetch water, gather firewood, and perform countless tasks essential to the family's survival. Play, if it existed at all, was snatched in rare, stolen moments, overshadowed by the endless labor that defined their days. Hunger, sickness, and danger haunted every stage of life, ensuring that few peasants lived long enough to see their grandchildren grow, and those who did carried bodies, bent and broken by decades of toil. The fragility of life was perhaps the most constant truth. A simple infection, a broken bone, or a failed harvest could spell death, and there were no safety nets, no protections, and no guarantees. Disease struck without warning, sweeping through villages and leaving devastation in its wake. Famine returned again and again, and when food ran short, peasants ate bark, boiled weeds, or starved in silence. Even in times of relative plenty, hunger was never far away, and every meal carried with it the memory of empty seasons past. Winter was especially cruel, when cold gnawed at bones and firewood dwindled, when livestock died in their stalls and bellies ached with want. Survival depended not only on hard work, but on sheer luck, and luck was seldom in abundant supply. The knowledge that everything could be undone by a bad season or an outbreak of illness weighed heavily, and yet, peasants endured, because endurance was all they had. Poverty was not simply a condition, it was a prison. Bound by feudal obligations, peasants paid rent to their lords in grain, livestock, or labor, leaving little for themselves. They surrendered tithes to the church, offered dues at every turn, and faced fines and penalties for even the smallest infractions. If a family managed to put aside a small surplus, it could vanish overnight. A lord might raise demands, a band of soldiers might raid the village, or a sudden illness might force desperate spending. There was no path to wealth, no ladder to climb, no opportunity to rise above their station. To be born a peasant was to inherit a life already scripted, one that promised work, submission, and struggle, and ended most often in an unmarked grave. This lack of mobility, this sense that the world was closed off, made hope itself a scarce commodity. And yet, peasants continued to hope, if not for themselves, then for their children. Even if the reality was that little would change. Violence was a constant shadow. Lords fought wars that peasants neither chose nor understood, but they paid the price all the same. Soldiers trampled fields, burned homes, stole livestock, and pressed villagers into service, leaving devastation in their wake. Bandits lurked on roads and in forests, preying on travelers and isolated communities. Even within villages, disputes could turn violent, as desperation and anger erupted into fights that ended with scars, or worse. Women were especially vulnerable, their lives marked not only by endless labor, but by the constant threat of exploitation. Their voices rarely heard, their suffering often dismissed. Children, too, bore the brunt of violence, from beatings handed down as discipline to the brutality of a world that demanded they grow up too quickly. Life was dangerous, and while peasants adapted, the sense of vulnerability never vanished. To live as a peasant was to live knowing that the world around you could turn hostile at any moment. Yet amid all this hardship, there was resilience, because there had to be. Communities clung together, sharing what little they had. Helping neighbors repair homes, sharing bread when hunger struck. Gathering in fields and churches not only out of necessity, but also for companionship. There was laughter, fleeting but real, around fires on cold nights, or at festivals that punctuated the year with moments of color and music. Songs and stories passed down through generations provided not only entertainment, but also a reminder that peasants were part of something larger. A chain of life that stretched back into the past and forward into the unknown. These small joys did not erase the hardship, but they softened it, and in them lay the strength that made survival possible. As peasants aged, their bodies bore the evidence of their struggles: bent backs, missing teeth, calloused hands, and faces weathered by sun and wind. Few lived past their 40s, and those who did were considered old by the standards of their time. Death was a familiar presence, not hidden away but woven into daily life, visible in the graves that dotted churchyards, and in the constant reminders of mortality that came with each passing sickness or accident. Funerals were both somber and communal, offering a rare moment when grief and solidarity intertwined, reminding peasants that though life was harsh and often short, it was shared. For those left behind, the cycle continued, unbroken, relentless, the weight of survival passing to the next generation. The legacy of the medieval peasant is not written in grand castles or illuminated manuscripts, but in the simple truth that they endured. They fed the world, built the fields, carried the stones, and bore the weight of a system designed to keep them down. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories seldom told. But without them, the lords and kings, the priests and merchants, could not have thrived. Theirs was a history of silence, of sweat and sacrifice, of lives lived largely unseen. yet their endurance was extraordinary in its own way. Though their days were filled with hunger, labor, fear, and pain, they also found ways to love, to laugh, and to hope, however faintly. It was a life that, to us, seems almost unbearable, and yet they bore it because there was no other choice. In the end, the story of the medieval peasant is one of survival against overwhelming odds, of humanity persisting in the harshest of conditions, and of people whose struggles, though often invisible, formed the foundation of the medieval world. Their lives may have been marked by suffering, but they were also marked by resilience, and it is in that resilience that their true legacy lies. And so, when we look back at the lives of medieval peasants, we see a story not of glory or triumph, but of endurance. Day after day, year after year, they carried the weight of a world that demanded everything from them, and gave so little in return. They tilled the soil, built the fields, and fed the kingdoms, all while enduring hunger, disease, violence, and poverty that we today can hardly imagine. Their lives were short, their names forgotten, yet their collective labor was the very backbone of the medieval world. Without them, the castles, cathedrals, and kingdoms we so often marvel at could never have existed. It is a story of hardship, yes, but also of resilience. Because despite the odds, they endured, they loved, and they lived.